In our last video, we began looking at the setup process of the AirLogix Centrifugal Compressor controller. This is part 2 of that process, entitled I/O Setup. From the main screen, let's go to the Setup menu. All screens in the Setup menu can be viewed by anyone. But, for this section, we'll need credentials in order to change setup data. I'm going to click on Login and enter my username and password. Last time, we worked with control system configuration. Today, we'll explore the next 5 buttons, which allow custom setup of the I/O of the controller. The first one being discrete input configuration. Here, we see a list of 16 possible discrete inputs, each with a symbol to the left. The red X means the input is disabled. The black indicator means the input is off, while the yellow one means it is on. I'm going to expand on the first one, which is labeled low water pressure. Here, we see a pop-up window, which allows configuration of this input. In this example, I'm going to assume we don't have a water pressure switch, but rather, a water flow switch. As you can see, by clicking on the title of the input, I can rename it to match the device that's actually wired to this particular input. Let's say, we're using a water flow switch instead. Next, I'm going to enable this input, and we can see its current condition is false. This button allows me to tell the controller the device is wired normally open or normally closed. I'm going to tell the controller that water flow should be a start permissive, and that it should also be a warning should the condition exist for more than 3 seconds. Because these are discrete inputs, they cannot be both a warning and a trip. So only one can be selected. Once more, I'm going to select a spare input and call it New Device. Moving to the next screen, we find the first 8 analog inputs. And then again, the second 8 analog inputs. Let's imagine this is a 3-stage machine, and there is no 4th stage vibration. Therefore, I can repurpose that spare input. Let's call it discharge airflow. As before, I can enable and disable analog inputs. Now, here is a new field called Input Scale. The old vibration probe was scaled from 0 to 4 mils. But this flow meter will be scaled from 0 to 12,000 CFM. Again, I'm going to repurpose this same input to be used for cooling water temperature. And I'll change the scaling range to 0 to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. When scaling an input, it is important that the range used here matches exactly the range of the device that is wired to its corresponding input. Now, let's set a high-level alarm limit of 120 degrees, and enable the start permissive as well. Next, I'll make the time delay for an alarm to occur only after 3 seconds of excessive temperature. And lastly, let's change the units of measure to reflect degrees Fahrenheit. Notice, there are not only start permissive, warning and trip limits for the high range, but also for the low range when it is appropriate. For example, oil pressure would require a low-range start permissive, warning, and a trip. Now, you can see the second 8 of the 16 default analog inputs include cooling water temperature, in place of the 4th stage vibration, which wasn't needed. You can also see the current value of cooling water temperature is 60 degrees. Suppose your compressor has a need for more than 16 analog devices. This is not uncommon. Clicking through to the next screen takes us to an expanded set of common analog devices. Like all I/O devices on the AirLogix controller, any analog input can be renamed, rescaled, and configured for use in the way you have just seen. But, attempting to enable an analog input for an I/O module that is not installed in the AirLogix controller will present an alarm banner that says, Analog Input Module Not Present, and will identify the relevant PLC slot. In this case, it is necessary to physically add one or more analog input modules to the PLC. This can be easily done by turning off control power, removing the I/O rack end cap, and installing the analog input module to the next slot position as seen here. It is important to replace the I/O rack end cap before the PLC will function properly. Next, restore power, which will reboot the PLC, and let's try it again. Again, the path is Main Menu, Setup, and we just installed Analog Input Module 2. With the new Analog Input Module now installed, I'm going to configure motor winding temperatures, A, B and C. These will not be start permissives, but they will have a warning and a trip value associated with them. Now that motor winding temp A has been configured, I will repeat the process for B and C. While I'm doing so, let me explain about two more fields that can be configured for each analog input. Here, you can select the input signal range, whether it be 1 to 5 volts DC, or 4 to 20 mA current. And here, where you can enable or disable input signal range warning. This setting would provide for a warning if the input signal falls outside of the stated range. This might be an indication of a failed or defective instrument. Now, I'm going to log out, so that no one else can use my credentials to make unauthorized changes to the controller configuration. As you can see, AirLogix is extremely flexible, allowing you to adapt to a number of scenarios you might encounter in the field, and without making changes to the PLC code. That's it for this session. Join us for part 3, when we will continue instruction on how to set up the AirLogix centrifugal controller. And thanks for watching.